in the seventh heaven, Ruthie and TBone's relationship was one that stuck, while Martin and Ruthie did not happen. Even though many fans feel like Martin and Ruthie made more sense, he is right. TBone and Ruthie's plot convenience relationship. TBone was introduced late in the series. The writers leaned into a cocky teen romance arc between him and Ruthie. The relationship was written to highlight Ruthie's independence and first real love, even though it wasn't very stable. The infamous text message breakup with Mac's help being blasted to Ruthie's whole family showed just how immature and poorly thought out the pairing really was. It didn't make much sense emotionally, but it was used to light-hearted teen drama in the final season. Why Martin and Ruthie made more sense. Martin and Ruthie had a deeper history and a stronger foundation. Martin was practically family, and Ruthie had genuine feelings for him that were explored more naturally than TBone. Despite Martin having a child with Sandy, he didn't end up with Sandy romantically, leaving the door open for Ruthie's relationship that many viewers thought would have been the more logical resolution. The bond had emotional weight because it grew over the years, not just a season or two. Ruthie and Martin's story carried a sense of realism. Two people navigating complicated circumstances while still clearly caring for each other. Why writers chose TBone over Martin. By the time the series was wrapping, the writers seemed to have wanted to avoid messy or controversial endings. Pairings Ruthie with Martin, who had a child with somebody else, might have felt too heavy for the show's final tone. TBone offered a lighter and more teen-friendly ending. Even though it didn't make much sense, it was simple. Ruthie ended up with a boyfriend her age with less baggage. The decision also gave Martin a clean break. He remained tied to Sandy and his son, rather than pulled into another romantic arc right at the close of the series. In short, Ruthie and TBone ended up together not because it made more sense, but because the writers wanted a neat, uncomplicated teen romance to close up her arc. Martin and Ruthie would have been a stronger and more believable pairing, but his child with Sandy in the show needed a tidy ending, kept that from happening. The whole promise ring storyline between Ruthie and TBone felt rushed and mishandled, especially compared to the build-up Ruthie had with Martin. Let's break down why. How could it happen? Ruthie will meet TBone after she returned from her Europe study abroad program. By that point, she was still in high school and had started figuring herself out after her trip. She and TBone had barely any real history before suddenly being pushed into a serious relationship with a promise ring involved. The ring was supposed to symbolize commitment in the future, but it came out of nowhere because they weren't even dating long enough to justify that kind of weighty gesture. The promise ring didn't work. The symbolization clashed with Ruthie's character's growth. She just came back from Europe, a storyline meant to show her independence, maturity, and self-discovery. Jumping straight into a promise ring undercut that growth. TBone himself wasn't written particularly mature or stable. He needed Mac's help just to break up with Ruthie in a group text, which only made the ring storyline feel more ridiculous in hindsight. Instead of being heartfelt, the promise ring turned into a plot device that made their relationship look forced and awkward rather than genuine. Why it felt wrong compared to Martin. Ruthie and Martin used a friendship and emotional groundwork. Even if complicated by Martin's child with Sandy, the dynamic felt earned. A promise ring between Ruthie and Martin would have carried much more emotional depth, since they actually had a believable history of caring for each other. Instead, the writers gave that milestone moment to Ruthie and TBone, a couple that hadn't been tested or developed, making it feel hollow. The misstep. By giving Ruthie a sudden, heavy storyline with TBone, the writers seem to be trying to give her a big romance in the final season. But because it was rushed, it clashed with Ruthie's established arc, and left the fans feeling like the writers ignored her natural connection with Martin. Especially the show traded emotional realism for convenient closure, and the promise ring ended up symbolizing a relationship that never really made sense. The bottom line, the promise ring arc between Ruthie and TBone was a conveyed attempt to give Ruthie a teenage happy ending, but it undermined her character growth, ignored the deeper and more authentic relationship she had with Martin. The tattoo storyline with Ruthie and TBone was one of the strangest and most unrealistic arcs Seventh Heaven ever gave Ruthie. Here's why it felt so wrong. Totally out of character for Ruthie. Ruthie had always been portrayed as a sharp, thoughtful Camden kid who questioned things and pushed boundaries, but she wasn't reckless to the point of tattooing a boyfriend's name on herself. She just returned from Europe, a storyline meant to show how she was more mature and worldly. To immediately follow that, her making a rash decision like tattooing TBone's name was completely inconsistent with her character's growth. The relationship wasn't deep enough. Ruthie and TBone hadn't been dating long. They met after she came back from studying abroad. Their romance was never shown to have depth or history that would make a tattoo make sense. Tattoos of each other's name was usually tied to a long-term bond or a very impulsive, reckless kind of love, but the show never established that kind of passion between Ruthie and TBone. Instead, it came across as a shallow teen drama and felt like a forced way to make the relationship look serious. As I should say, early in the series, the Camdens often like lessons about choices, consequences, and responsibility. But here, the tattoo storyline almost played like a joke. It didn't feel like a teachable moment. It just made Ruthie look careless and immature. That undermined her development as one of the more grounded Camden kids. Fans were left asking, why would writers think Ruthie should go for something so cliche and reckless? If Ruthie had a storyline showing her feelings for Martin were long-lasting and complicated, it would have been far more believable her impulsively tattooing than her impulsively tattooing TBone's name. With Martin, her choice might have at least reflected some deeply emotional conflict, love, and history. With TBone, it felt empty and random. Bottom line, the tattoo storyline was so messed up because it ignored Ruthie's intelligence, maturity, and natural arc. It reduced her kid to a stereotype of rebellious teen making a dumb choice, and tying that to TBone, a relationship that lacked weight and only made it worse. You beat down to the most frustrating points about the Ruthie Martin TBone triangle. Martin's hospital confession. The moment that Martin confessed his feelings for Ruthie at the hospital was one of the most powerful and heartfelt scenes of the late seasons. It was raw, emotional, and showed that despite all the complications of his life, Sandy, his son, his struggles with responsibility, Ruthie was somebody he deeply cared about. This was the kind of confession that would have reshaped both their arcs in a meaningful way, but the writers undercut it by not letting Ruthie respond honestly. Instead of giving Ruthie the chance to say she still loves Martin or wanted to be with him, the scene was written as her feelings were left hanging, which left fans frustrated. A more satisfying choice would have been Ruthie acknowledging her feelings too, even if it complicated things. That would have honored both their growth and long-standing connection. TBone claiming to be part of the Camden family. When TBone told Martin he was now part of the Camden family, it came out smug, mean-spirited, and unearned. TBone only been around for a short time. While Martin lived with the Camdens, relied on them, been treated as a family for years. For him, the Camdens were a second home. Hearing TBone saying that not only invalidated Martin's history, but also highlighted how forced TBone and Ruthie's storyline was. It felt like the writers were trying to prop up TBone by tearing Martin down, which was unfair to both characters. why it felt so wrong. Ruthie and Martin's storyline for years of build-up and emotional depth in real history. T-Bone's relationship with Ruthie had almost none of that. Martin confessing at the hospital would have been the natural climax of their arc, but instead the writers sidelined it for the sake of pushing T-Bone. By doing so, they not only robbed Ruthie of an honest response, but diminished Martin's place in the Camden family, which felt wrong and disrespectful to the character. Bottom line, the hospital confession would have been a perfect moment for Ruthie and Martin to finally acknowledge their feelings for each other. Instead, the writers forced Ruthie into her silence and used T-Bone to undercut Martin, which made the ending feel mean and conveyed rather than authentic. This car scene between Ruthie and Martin before the RV vacation was another moment in the writing that pushed her towards T-Bone in a way that felt forced and untrue to Ruthie's heart. Let's break it down. Ruthie cheating on Martin. When Martin asked Ruthie about her feelings, her response was hesitant and conflicted. She said she wanted to travel with the person she was supposed to be with, which the show positioned as T-Bone. But the delivery of that line fell off. Ruthie's hesitation suggests she wasn't being completely honest, more like she was trying to convince herself. If you look at Ruthie's history with Martin, it was clear she always had a deeper feeling for him. Her rejection in the car didn't match the years of build-up, especially after Martin had already made his feelings clear in the hospital. Whether it has made her choose T-Bone, at that point the writer seems determined to give Ruthie a teen romance ending with somebody uncomplicated. Martin's baggage, Sandy, his son, and his struggles with responsibility would have made their relationship more complex, and the show was winding down. So instead of letting Ruthie be true to her emotions, the writers forced her into an easier choice, T-Bone. But in doing so, they flattened her character, ignored the natural pull between her and Martin. When Ruthie and Martin felt first, T-Bone proposed. They led in the series, and after Ruthie's Europe trip, with little time to develop anything meaningful. Their big promising tattoos the Camden family claim and traveling together, all felt conveyed as if the writers were scrambling to make them look like a real couple. Meanwhile, Ruthie and Martin's years of friendship, history, and unspoken love were brushed aside, which is why many fans will still see Martin as the better fit. The missed opportunity. The car scene would have been a place for Ruthie to finally be honest with Martin. Even if she wasn't ready to jump into a relationship right before vacation, she could have admitted, I do have feelings for you too, but I'm scared and I need time. Instead, the writers had her reject to T-Bone, making it a choice when really it felt like a show forced her there for convenience. Bottom line, Ruthie telling Martin she wanted to travel with somebody else was never the full truth. It was the writer's way of cementing her with T-Bone, even though her actions and history with Martin showed otherwise. That's why their relationship felt rushed, artificial, while Ruthie and Martin had emotional backbone of a real natural ending. Got it. Here's the cleanup. Okay, by the end of the series, Sandy was more a part of the Camden family than T-Bone ever was. The Camden stood by her during her pregnancy, offering real guidance and support, which made her bond with the family genuine. Sandy also had her own history with them. She wasn't just Martin's baby mama. She had even Simon's college classmate and had her own ties to their world. On top of that, Sandy already moved on forward with her life. She was engaged to somebody else, showing that she and Martin were not going to end up together. What made her role so important is that she actually encouraged Martin to be honest about his feelings for Ruthie, unlike T-Bone, whose connection to the Camdens felt shallow and forced. Sandy's presence was organic. Her encouragement highlighted what could have been the natural direction for Martin and Ruthie's story. This emphasizes that Sandy earned her place with the Camdens, while T-Bone never really did, and it underlines how Sandy herself pushed Martin towards Ruthie. There's actually Which is one of the most controversial storyline choices in the later of the seasons of Seventh Heaven. This back early set up with Simon. When Sandy first appeared pregnant, the show strongly hinted that Simon might be the father. It would have tied into Simon's college storyline and the Camden family's ongoing themes about responsibility and consequences and forgiveness. Many fans felt that setup was deliberate to show Simon struggling with adulthood choices and how his life path was changing. Why the writers shifted to Martin. According to the interviews and fan discussions, the writers changed the direction because they didn't want to permanently damage Simon's character arc. Simon was always the responsible son. Making him the teenage father would have anchored him to Sandy in a way that limited his future storyline. By shifting the parentage to Martin, the writers kept Simon's clean in the long run, while still keeping the teen parent storyline alive. Martin was a more convenient choice because he wasn't a Camden by blood. His struggles as a teenage father would have shown without permanently altering the central Camden family dynamic. Why the choice for us? The change undermined the original setup. Fans would have felt the pivot and made Sandy and Martin's connection seem forced. Simon's storyline last emotional depth. He ended up being sidelined into guilt and position instead of growth and accountability. Meanwhile, Martin, who already had a responsibility theme with his military dad and strict upbringing, got another burden that sometimes overshadowed his character's lighter traits. The impact on Ruthie. Keeping Martin as Aaron's father meant his relationship with Ruthie was always clouded by Sandy. If Simon had been the father, Sandy's storyline would have stayed closer to him, freeing Martin's arc to focus more honestly on his feelings for Ruthie. In a way, the writers chose to protect Simon ended up hurting Martin and Ruthie's potential. And since Martin was weighed down with a child storyline, that was never fully resolved. Bottom line, the writers took the fatherhood storyline away from Simon because they didn't want him tied down as a teen dad. They wanted to keep his future open. They handed it to Martin as a safer option, but in doing so, they weakened Simon's arc and complicated Martin's, which in turn blocked the natural path towards Ruthie and Martin being in-game. If Simon had been Aaron's father instead of Martin, it would have been completely changed the late series dynamics of Seventh Heaven. Here's how it might have played out. If Simon was Aaron's father, he and Sandy would have been forced into a deeper partnership. Even if they weren't in love, co-parenting would have tied them together in ways the show never explored. At first, Simon likely would have felt conflicted, or part of him wanting to do the right thing and build a relationship with Sandy, while another part resented the way his life would have been derailed. Over time, though, the Camden support would have made it possible for Simon and Sandy to grow closer. Their relationship would have matured into something stable and respectful, possibly even successful long-term, if the writers leaned into it. Sandy was already shown as somebody with ambition and warmth. Pairing her with Simon, who was responsible and caring, would have created a strong foundation for them as young parents. Martin, without the burden of fatherhood. If Martin wasn't Aaron's father, his character arc would have opened up. Instead of being weighed down by Sandy and child support drama, he would have been forced to focus on his own growth. This freedom would have allowed the show to fully explore his relationship with Ruthie, without Sandy being in the middle. Martin's military background and his struggles with responsibility still would have been explored, but without heavy baggage of teenage fatherhood. Ruthie and Martin's relationship, with Martin not tied to Sandy, his confession to Ruthie at the hospital would have been carried even more weight. Nothing would have been holding him back. Ruthie in turn would have felt safer in admitting her feelings for Martin. The triangle tension would have disappeared, letting them finally become a couple in a way that was both natural and satisfying. The relationship would have been built on years of friendship, unspoken love, making them much stronger in-game than Ruthie and TBone. overall impact on the show. Making Simon Aaron's father would have been giving Simon a grounded adult storyline that reflected real life struggles young people face in college. It also would have honored the show's original message about family and responsibility. Sandy's character would have been given a more authentic and long-term place in the Camden family. Her bond wouldn't have felt borrowed through Martin, but through Simon. Most important, Ruthie and Martin's arcs would have been able to been free to evolve what many fans expect, a relationship that grew natural for years of closure and honesty. If Simon had been Aaron's father, Simon and Sandy would have built a strong and prosperous, successful relationship as co-parents and maybe even as partners. While Martin would have been free to fully pursue Ruthie, the end-game couples would have been Simon and Sandy, Ruthie and Martin, which would have felt more organic and true to the series than a first Ruthie and TBone ending. Here's my next. What if Sandy encouraged me earlier after Ruthie trying to open his has the feelings for it instead of just interesting TBone. If that happened, the entire dynamic of the final season would have been very different. Ruthie wouldn't have pushed into a Russian shower relationship with TBone, which never felt organic. Instead, the focus would have been on Martin and Ruthie, fully acknowledging what had been building between them for years. Sandy's role. Sandy was already moving forward in her life. By that point, she had outgrown the unresolved ties to Simon and was on a path towards her own happy ending, pairing her with Jonathan, a doctor who gave her stability and independence that had nothing to do with Martin or Simon. This meant she could encourage Martin with no lingering romantic conflict. Martin's confession. If Martin had told Ruthie how he really felt earlier, Ruthie would have had the space to admit her own feelings. Would admit her feelings back. Instead of being funneled into a teen romance with TBone. Their history together, from Martin living with the Camdens to Ruthie quickly having feelings for him, would have made their relationship believable and meaningful. Ruthie and Martin as endgame. Without TBone in the picture, Ruthie and Martin would have become a natural endgame couple. The relationship would have been built on years of shared history, family ties, emotional depth, rather than the last-minute first storyline that came with TBone, promise ring, tattoos, etc. If Sandy had pushed Martin to be honest about his feelings right after Ruthie returned from Europe, Ruthie and Martin most likely certainly would have ended up together. Sandy herself would have found happiness with Jonathan, a doctor leaving Simon free of her storyline. The vision of the events would have felt truer to the characters and provided more satisfying resolution than Ruthie and TBone's rush and awkward romance. Mac was one of the few people who saw through Martin's walls. He absolutely knew Martin was into Ruthie. Mac had a way of calling Martin out, often teasing him, but also knowing when Martin was hiding something. Whenever Martin showed extra concern or interest in Ruthie, even trying to cover it up, Mac usually picked up on it. He wasn't blind to how Martin looked at her or how protective he was around her. In fact, Mac hinted a few times that Martin wasn't being honest with about Ruthie, which showed he would have read between the lines. Anytime Martin wanted to talk to a Camden, it was usually come back to Ruthie. Sure, he respected Eric and looked up to Annie in a parental way. He was close to the family as a whole, but Ruthie was always the one who stirred him the most. Mac probably noticed how Martin treated Ruthie differently than the others. His tone, his defensiveness, even jealousy that crept up when Ruthie was interested in someone else. Why this matter? The fact that Mac could see Martin's true feelings reinforced that Martin's love for Ruthie wasn't some sudden and random confession at the hospital. It'd been there, quietly growing for a long time. It also shows that Ruthie and Martin did make sense as a couple. Even if somebody like Mac, who wasn't part of the Camden family, recognized Martin's feelings, then the writers would have arguments for Ruthie and Martin become endgame, but chose to ignore them in favor of forcing Ruthie with TBone. If Max knew TBone was into Ruthie, he probably understood better than anyone that whenever Martin wanted to talk to a cat in particular, it usually meant Ruthie. This makes Martin's confession later on even more authentic. It was something that others had seen in him all along.